Hello and welcome to this event. I'm really pleased to see so many of you here. My name is Celia Lurie. I'm one of the researchers on a project called People Like You, Contemporary Figures of Personalization. This is a Wellcome Trust funded study of practices of personalization in the fields of data science, healthcare, and digital media. And as part of this project, researchers based at Warwick, Imperial and Goldsmiths universities have collaborated with 3 artists, Di Sherlock, Stephanie Posavec, and Felicity Allen. And we're very proud to be able to launch today, this evening, or whatever time you're at, the work that Felicity, or Flick as I'm going to call her, produced as part of her residency for this project. And this work included portraits, which are shown in an online exhibition titled Rooms, and the film Figure to Ground, A Site Losing Its System. Both of these can be found on the project's website, which is peoplelikeyou.ac.uk. Going to say a little about the project before we move into talking about Flick's work. The title of the project comes from the phrase, people like you like things like this. It's a phrase which is associated with recommendation systems, recommendation algorithms, such as those used by Netflix or Spotify. And in the project, we're interested in the ways in which personalization, while appearing to offer individualized, personalized experience of some kind, is simultaneously a classification of many. And one of the claims we're exploring is how these classifications of a simultaneously singular and plural you emerge in relations of liking or preference, I like this, and likeness, similarity or resemblance. I am like my sister or not. People like you like things like this. And one of the things that we have been working on with Flick is how these relations of liking and likeness have always been at issue in practices of portraiture. And it's why we're interested in and have learnt a lot from Flick's practice and work. And now we're going to move into an exploration of that. And to start us off, we've invited Barry Shvovsky to speak. He's an art critic for The Nation and co-editor of international reviews for Artforum. Recent books include The Perpetual Guest, Art in the Unfinished Present, and The Observer Effect on Contemporary Painting. His new collection of poetry, Feelings of and, is forthcoming from Black Square Editions, and he edited Simon Smith's More Flowers Than You Could Possibly Carry. He curated the exhibition Tightrope Walk, Painted Images After Abstraction at the White Cube in London, 2015-16. So thank you, Barry, and I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say. Again, we're now going to turn to The Rooms, which is the name of the online exhibition that we put together with Lizzie Malcolm from the design agency Rectangle. The fact that it's online is, as so many things now, is a response to the situation with COVID-19. And it was, I think all of us found it quite challenging. And one of the things we considered was whether we wanted to try to directly reproduce the experience of an offline exhibition, which we decided wasn't possible, and to do something else, which could be described in many ways, but I think is in a way a sort of analogical way to reproduce the offline experience online, with this grouping of some of the portraits in a series of virtual rooms, and the rooms are curated by Flick. We decided not to hang the portraits as if on a wall, but nevertheless to position them relative to each other within each room. But we also gave the viewer the possibility of enlarging them and rearranging them. And we found the difficulty of reproducing the possibility of a viewer in an offline space, of getting up close to an image, impossible, really, very hard to do. And I think that was something that was particularly frustrating for Flick. From my point of view as a researcher, the rooms were a way to think about grouping, categorizing, classifying the portraits, though not the persons that they contain. That is, I saw the kinds of groupings in the rooms as not being about persons, but about speaking to some of, as it were, the organizing principles of the practice of dialogic portraits, some of which I think Barry's already alluded to. But perhaps, Flick, you can say a bit about how you see them and take us through one or two of the rooms.
Yeah, okay. I'll do that now, shall I? Yeah, okay. Well, just let me just say, to get it out of the way, just the film was quite corrupted at the beginning. There was quite a lot out of sync and not really showing properly. So I do hope that you get a chance to have a look at it again. It's online for you. But first of all, anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thank you to my colleagues at People Like You, who've been wonderful to work with, and to all the sitters who've been wonderful to work with, and some of whom have come, I think, this evening, and to Barry and Celia and Janice and Will, who are talking this evening. I wanted to say something briefly about the dialogic portraits process, and some of this could be interesting in relation to what Barry's just been saying, and build on it in some ways, or maybe explain some things a bit more. I make them, as you know, in series, and usually I invite the sitters to spend a minimum of 2 days sitting for me, and I make a minimum of 2 watercolor pictures of each person. During the sittings, we talk with one another as I'm painting, and at some point after the sitting, I record a discussion between us that relates to the sitting and to the, if you like, the kind of reflections on the series themselves. Subsequently, I work with the recordings and the pictures to make a film or a book. This means the pictures act as, at least as, these 3 things. One is as original works of art in the conventional sense that can be exhibited. One is as documents of time spent together by the sitter and me. And another is as archive material from which to make new work through digital processes, such as photography, film, and print on demand. I'm now going to share my screen. Let's see if it can work. Let's see. Okay.
Yep, it works.
Good. Okay. So I'm just go there. Sorry, it just takes me a minute to get to where I need to be. Okay. For each dialogic portrait series, there are issues about how the sitters and I mutually select one another. I hope that the sitting portraying experience will be pleasurable, although there are likely to be moments of friction, if only because of my own preoccupations and failings. Because I'm mostly based outside London, some sitters have come and stayed, for instance, a weekend. So hosting them is part of my labor as an artist. And this may involve inviting people who I scarcely know. For this series, I had a number of criteria when inviting people to take part. Not everyone accepts the invitation, and most people don't meet all of the criteria. These were, for instance, the criteria were, for instance, critical awareness of data's uses, possibility for clustering in groups with others, for instance, as a family or as a band, interest in proxy selves or the self as proxy, personal experience of politics regarding nationality, citizenship, and being situated as illegal, personal relationship to portraiture, whether as a maker or an owner, or whose ancestors have commissioned but then disposed of family portraits. I also wanted to make sure that I included people who represented a range of different types of relationships with me, whether as colleagues or friends or family or activists. Because of the power politics behind some of these criteria, which I don't want to endorse, it was important to me that the criteria didn't become categories, and the online rooms have mostly mixed people up. There are 8 rooms which, rather than categorizing the people portrayed, are more likely to represent the dialogic process of making the pictures. This includes my own internal dialogues about picture making and developing the project, which are informed by conversations with the sitters, my experience of the sittings, and the portraits themselves, as well as what I've been learning from the People Like You research project. So the rooms are titled Common Denominator, At Home, Conversation Pieces, Back and Forth, Standard Sized, Non-Standard Sized, Unlike, and Dare to Be Like. And I just want to mention something about each one very, very briefly, and I'll take you into 1 or 2 rooms. So Common Denominator was a way of thinking about the network within the series, how I was making networks. At Home, it identifies the way familiarity through, for instance, repeat sittings can improve the quality of the pictures, in my view, whereas those in my immediate family might be less likely to give time to sit for me. And so I produce less good pictures. One reason they might give less time is because my own familiarity leads me to dare to portray them in ways that they're not necessarily going to find flattering. Conversation pieces, and most of these pictures in this don't fall into the art historical category of conversation pieces, was a way of bringing together portraits in which I'd tried to disturb my own habit of painting just the head and shoulders, the face full frontal. Back and Forth, which relates to the At Home room in a way, shows a series of portraits I made with 2 different people, and one's along the top here and one's along the bottom here. I don't know whether me doing the, anyway, whatever, we'll see. with this, so I made a series of portraits with 2 different people. This is the one with Amana that I did on the first day. And with the second sitting, it was apparent to me that each of the sitters in this series had thought about and responded to how we worked together for the second sitting. This is the second day with Amana. Amana is a performer and a dancer. And as I was working with her on the second occasion, I realized how much she was putting into giving me a version of herself that she wanted to sort of experiment with, if you like. And of course, I'm conscious that all of the sitters are in some sense performing. And in this case, I think both of these 2 sitters had that consciousness themselves, which isn't always the case. I was really, really interested in how this developed. So this is the third picture. After the second day, I invited both of these sitters to work with me some more and to do 2 more days. So altogether we did 4 days working together, because I was really interested in how we were not necessarily articulating the negotiation, but there was a negotiation quite consciously between us in terms of how I was portraying and how the portrait could develop, let's say. I put these pictures in this sequence to try and suggest, okay, you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and similarly here with these ones. But in fact, if I was going to hang them together, for instance, I might move them around, make them come down different ways like this, maybe this one down here, and so on and so forth. So one of the constructions is that you're able to move things around yourself to think about the curation, if you like, or at least the arrangement. Standard size. I'm intrigued to think if we'll talk more about the grid, given what Barry showed us. In my adult lifetime, it's been a curatorial norm in real life galleries to hang series of pictures of a similar size together. And this has been reinforced by the use of minimalist grids, for instance, in displays of the portrait series Rejects by Marlene Dumas. In the case of portraits, one could argue that the grid replicates the self-other formula that positions the viewer as distinct from the viewed. Zoom and other digital media potentially disrupt this by including the image of the self within the grid. This room here, standard size, includes the gap for a possible additional frame for the viewer. The non-standard size, which is the one that you saw at the beginning, shows a contrast to the standard size room. Unlike, I don't think these pictures sufficiently resemble the sitters to be considered a likeness. I'm interested in this both as a failure, but also as a form of creating fictional people, which could be compared with other artists' work in portraiture, like, for instance, Lynette Yiadom-Boakye. And finally, Dare to Be Like, which is the last series. These are all of one person and one person with another one. My last comment about unlike provokes the question, as an artist, who do you sit yourself with and where does your artistic heritage lie? For a woman of my generation, this is an especially difficult question, as we were repeatedly instructed that we couldn't be serious artists, that we had to choose between motherhood and becoming artists, and that there had been no women artists before us. This sitter has a locatable ancestry because in the 17th century, a relative invested a sufficient sum in one of the king's colonial projects to be awarded a baronetcy. Sort of sounds familiar to contemporary life, really, which has been passed down through primogeniture, that is, through the line of the oldest male. Portraiture was one way of manifesting this, and portraits were commissioned from revered artists in this family, such as Joshua Reynolds and Henry Raeburn. So my question for myself was, dare I situate my portrait in that lineage? Thank you. That's if you could unshare me now, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Flick, for that. We've now got an opportunity to talk to some of the people two of the people who were sitters for you. And I'd like to introduce Will Viney, who is a researcher on the project People Like You, and Janice Cheddi, who is a writer and researcher, both of whom sat for Flick, and you might be able to recognize them now or not as featuring variously in the rooms and the film. So in a way, I think this is an opportunity for you both to speak, to help us develop this understanding of dialogic portraiture. And I'll start just with a question to Will, which is a sort of very simple question in a way, whether and how you experienced sitting as a dialogue, and also whether you feel able to say whether you liked the experience of sitting. So Will.
Thank you. So I think I really did enjoy the sitting, but it was a process that I had to learn to like. And that is not disconnected to how I experienced the dialogue, which was quite unfamiliar to me, like the staging of the dialogue. I mean, you have to imagine Flick is wearing a kind of, what I could only describe as sort of like a canteen, like I remember from school, like the dinner ladies, we called them, would serve food in a kind of smock. Oh, she's going to put it on, maybe. And so she'd stand in that room with this sort of thing and kind of peer at me from behind this easel that I couldn't see. You know, of course, I couldn't see the canvas. And so then, you know, I'd met Flick before, but I didn't really know her very well. I definitely hadn't been put in a room with her, just the two of us, quite kind of intimate, for like, I don't know, 6 to 8 hours until the daylight left. And then she was like, it's finished now. And then I left. So the whole experience was quite kind of surreal, and I had to kind of learn to accept that. And dialogue to me as a word suggests, or rather an invitation to a dialogue, is both serious, but also sort of, there's a parity to it somehow, but there wasn't a parity here. Like, she dictated how the dialogue worked in terms of timing. And if I was moving around too much, like using my mouth, then she'd stop me and we'd be in silence for a bit. So I think it was something I had to get used to. And like in the context of something, you know, something being made of me, which is not a normal kind of scenario to have a dialogue kind of in amongst.
Janice, what was your experience? Was it a dialogue?
I mean, I think it's because Will and I have a different relationship with Flick. I mean, I've known Flick for nearly 30 years, and primarily through the discourses around feminism. So I very much understood Flick's practice in that context around feminism, around representation, around rethinking the female gaze. And more importantly, I suppose I've also lived with painters. So the whole idea of sitting in the studio and talking to painters is something that I've been around most of my adult life. So I think it's a slightly different experience in relationship to that. So because I'd had that relationship with Flick, and I share a kind of intellectual understanding around feminist art practice, I was very aware that it was about the process of painting rather than her producing a likeness of me. And so therefore it was really about that dialogue was trying to understand a bit more than me, because we've never been close friends, but we've known each other for a long time, trying to kind of unravel what that relationship might mean and the back and forth between that. So in that sense, for me, it was a dialogic process within that. I think now that I look at the painting, there's another layer to it, because that was like the 28th of February, and it was really the last weekend of the 28th of February 2020. So it was really the last weekend of normality before the first UK COVID lockdown. So it was really prior to when we were really beginning to understand that this was a public health emergency. And also part of the dialogue is that I deliberately chose to wear something which was of my mother's. And it was partly to kind of say something about me and my connection with her, and that I wanted it within the painting. And that since because she was alive when the painting was done, but since she has now passed away. So it has a different of kind of emotional resonances for me. They're not necessarily in the painting, but that's how I would respond to them. And also in some ways, I think that's part of the dialogic process of the painting as well. So I think it's slightly different.
Will, I wonder whether you can say whether you like the portrait and whether that relates to whether you think it's a likeness or not. Because I know you said, Flick just said, oh, that's it, it's done now. But she said to me that you didn't want to see the portrait. And I also think that the first time we viewed the film in which your portrait appears, you didn't recognize yourself. And I'm just interested in that experience of liking and likeness.
Yeah, I think that there's a pleasure to all this. I mean, a part of it is a kind of game, because it's like kind of, it turns into a kind of cat and mouse. Is a way of kind of gamifying something that is otherwise kind of like a bit of a power relation, which is that Flick is producing an image of me in the way that I don't think producing an image of her. So there was that kind of imbalance, and I thought to myself that she started telling me about other people that she painted and their responses, and I thought, oh no, it's not like receiving a gift at Christmas or whatever, and there's going to be a moment where I do have to kind of be answerable to that gift in a kind of moment where recognition happens or is supposed to happen. And I thought to myself, sitting for the first picture, because there are two, I thought maybe I just don't have to look at it. And I think I asked you, Flick. I think I asked permission not to look, and you're very very gracious about that. And it became difficult because I have to sign the painting. So that was, we found a way of doing that, which was quite funny. And then the whole business of sort of reconciling myself to why I kind of didn't want to look at it, and why that might be, which, again, there are kind of probably very I mean, people might want to provide psychoanalytic and or feminist reasons for why that might be. But I think ultimately it did give me a kind of different kind of experience, which is that the idea of a profile being made of me that was kind of, it was in circulation, of which I hadn't quite kind of come into contact with. It was a kind of trace or something. And that was kind of interesting. And I mean, with my project hat as a researcher, I just think that that's something that might happen quite frequently in other walks of life where we are profiled, and that we have to kind of accept that there is a profile out there that may look a bit like or not look like us, and how we kind of manage that. But then on the other hand, you know, in being involved in these conversations and seeing Flick talk about her work, I realized that also my profile is part of a series, a kind of, I have company, or other people in the project provide me company, and so my sense of recognition then is really more shared than at least I first understood it could be.
And Janice, is liking part of your response at all? Is that?
I mean, you know, I suppose I wasn't, because I've seen Flick's work, and so I'm quite familiar with her work and the whole process, and generally the kind of history of portraiture, particularly in relationship to kind of contemporary Black art. This idea that it needed to look like me wasn't an issue, because, you know, everyday life is a performance, you know, and we have different roles in life and how we perform them. And so what I was expecting was something which was more, and which I was more interested in, was the process. And so to me, it didn't need to, you know, it didn't need to be instantly recognized, because it was more interested in the process of how that unfolds and what you choose to reveal about yourself at that particular moment. And, you know, and if she had painted me, perhaps, you know, like maybe a month into the lockdown, she would have got a very different image or perception of me. And I think that's, you know, it's really that. So, you know, because I was there for 2 days, and she did a couple of paintings, and she was umming and ahhing about them. But to me, they were kind of really, you know, signifying about the whole process, because she works very quickly, she's having a conversation with you, I'm moving around, I'm not sitting still. And so therefore the picture for me is always going to be about fluidity anyway. So yeah, I think I had a different relationship to it, I think. Yeah.
Flick, or do you want to respond to, I've got more questions I can ask, but do you want to respond to that? And Barry, if you want to join the conversation, do, but maybe Flick, do you want to say?
I'll just say one thing, which is that it hadn't occurred to me before that I suggested we might invite Will and Janice to talk, and luckily they said yes. And actually in the film, and I think this is where it got a bit glitchy, so you might not have heard it, but there is a series of 3 different men all talking about not seeing their work, or not seeing the images of themselves, not wanting images of themselves to be on the internet, and doing stuff to avoid that. And I was intrigued. I mean, I decided to put that in because I was intrigued about the gender, the fact that it was 3 men who said this, and none of the women were saying that. I mean, I don't think it's surprising, because I think as a woman, you are so used to the idea of female faces, women being, let's say, visual commodities that it just would seem impossible to try and stop us from doing. Clearly, there have been women who've done that, and I'm immediately thinking of the artist who, anyway, no, this is a red herring, but I positioned, in terms of the dialogue within the film, I positioned those three men saying things like that, and a couple of them are photographers, and they were saying they don't like having images of themselves out there. And Janice very generously said that she liked the painting and so did her daughter. So I included that in it as a kind of, a sort of counterpoint, not an argument, but a kind of counterpoint as a way of thinking about how we do or don't relate to our likeness in that way. And I chose to edit the film in that way for that reason, really.
Thank you. I think what you said, Janice, about wanting somehow to have something about your mother in the portrait, and then, you know, you saying she was alive and she is no longer, it's very moving and interesting. And I was very struck in terms of how certainly in the film, Flick and the people speaking make a real attempt to put the portraits into multiple histories. And I wonder whether you can say more about kind of like how you thought about that and what you wanted to do with that.
I mean, I think it's kind of two things. Is that because my mother's quite elderly, was quite elderly then, you know, it was the fact of life that she wasn't going to be around for much longer. So and there's a long process, because my mother had dementia, there's a long process where you have to come to terms with failing mental capacity and then just physical frailty. So there's this long process that you have to kind of go through. So I was very aware of that. And also I was aware that out of all the people within my family, and particularly within my mother's grandchildren, shall we say, that, you know, I look very much like her. And so therefore there isn't anybody else in the family that looked like her apart from me. And then particularly within the kind of grandchildren, you know, that look that we have isn't present within any of the grandchildren. So I was very aware of this kind of likeness, not likeness within that. And I think Flick and I talked about, you know, the whole thing about kind of black people being painted in thing, and that history as well. So we talked a lot about that in terms of the gaze within that. And so there was a lot of discussion about how you think through those kind of historical processes of how representation is around a body that is surveyed a lot. So because, you know, people always want to read, so I'm misraced all the time, but people always want to read through just by looking at me. And it's through people who hardly know me will ask, well, what are you? And it's like, you know, I don't even know you. And you want me to go through 3 generations of my history for you. So we had a lot of that kind of conversation around that. So there was this kind of art historical moment about, you know, how that functions within the kind of history of painting, but also the kind of feminist take around that, how the kind of female gaze is generated with that. But I think in terms of the more personal history, it was really trying to have a kind of marker around the as I say in the film, around that shirt, because it was something that my mother bought, and it wasn't something she bought from the Caribbean, it was something she bought here, and that I remember her wearing it, and then I when she went into a nursing home, I then took that as one of the clothes that I wanted to keep, both as remembrance, but then I also wore it. But because it's a suit, then my daughter wears it. So it was that kind of generational kind of remembrance, almost memento, that's in some ways that's more important to me than whether the actual image looks like me, because the shirt looks like the shirt. And for me, it's that kind of, you know, intangible cultural element to me that's important. And obviously nobody else is going to have that meaning with that, but for me it was important to kind of situate her, because she's so important to my presence in this world, but also my kind of emotional and intellectual being, but also that she's also, because she spent a lot of time when my daughter was younger being a carer to my daughter as well. So it was trying to have that kind of intergenerational presence. And also I was very much aware that kind of other meaning of dialogical is also about a thing which plays with time, which has like multiple chronological things within that. So it was a play on that as well when I chose the shirts. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I know, Flick, you want to speak, but we've actually only got 10 minutes left. So if you promise to speak briefly, I will let you speak, but then we should turn to Scott, and maybe he can present some of the questions or ask some people to ask them. Do you want to just speak briefly, Flick? I'm sorry, there's not much time.
I've got one thing I want to say just in relation to that, which I'm really grateful to Janice for articulating so well, so clearly, because of course, for me, I found that history and the idea of the cloth, and a lot of people come, particularly women, I think, come with wearing things that came from their mothers or whatever, that were important in that way. But I found it very moving what Janice was saying, which is why that's in the film, because I think it says so much as a kind of, can I say, equivalent to the kind of baronetcy legacy through the portraiture. And I was really interested in that kind of idea of how families pass things down.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to cut the conversation short, but Scott, I don't know whether you have questions or that have come from the chat, and whether you want to invite people to speak if they've got questions.
I haven't received any questions in the chat. I have many different questions I could ask as someone who's been sort of observing this work for a while, but I did want to invite members of the audience to ask questions, or people who have sat for Flick, if you're in the audience, to share your reflections. Really appreciated what Will and Janice had to say about their experiences. So would anyone like to?
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I was very curious in the first place with something that Flick said along the way about how she had the one category where she put portraits that she thought were not good likenesses. And then also Janice just mentioned that she didn't really care that much about whether it would be a good likeness of her, as long as it was a good likeness of, you know, the fabric. And so I wanted to ask Flick about that on a couple of levels. One is the fact that there's a kind of big archive of images, something that allows you to sort of be more relaxed about your personal sense of the success or failure on different levels of different portraits, and to include them all because somehow the archive is greater than the individual entries in it. And also, in a more specific way, is there any correlation for you in this work between good likeness and good painting?
You have to unmute yourself.
One of the things that I have to deal with is trying not to please too much. And one of the things that I've been trained, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily know it from meeting me, but I have nevertheless been trained in trying to be pleasing. I think that I have this sort of very sort of primitive sense that if I make something that looks like somebody, they will be pleased. So for me, I want to make a likeness because I want to please the sitter. On the other hand, what I really care about is making a good painting. At least as much as I care about making a likeness. Ideally, I'd like to make a likeness that is also a good painting. So I am aiming for something like a likeness. I don't necessarily do it with each painting I make of someone. I might sort of think, okay, this one I want to try and get a likeness, and I'm not so bothered with this one or whatever. So in terms of the archive, the questions about grading, how you grade whether or not something's good enough. One of the things that seems to me possible about doing an exhibition online like this, where it isn't like a curated exhibition in a gallery, is that you can allow for failures in a way. I don't know. It's one of the things that in so you can incorporate the good with the bad and the sort of mediocre, and I wouldn't. I suppose there's a question around the pictures and the people, and in the context of the online stuff, it's a bit like being a school teacher. You know, the school teachers always want all of their children's work to be shown. They don't want to exclude a child from showing their work. It's a nuisance. And I think online, I felt like that. But I think if it was, well, I know if it was in a gallery, I would certainly be selective in terms of the quality of the pictures, let's say.
If I just jump in, I think you've talked about those failures as still being plausible. And I think that's a very interesting notion of kind of plausibility, that they might exist, they could have existed, they you know, it could be a person, that could be a person. And I think that I find that very interesting. And it also calls up for me when in his book on photography, Camera Lucida by Roland Barthes, he talks about something just being like. It doesn't have to be like anything in particular. It's just like. And I don't know, that opens up all sorts of possibilities, plausibilities anyway. But Scott, are there more questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question, Flick, about the word proxy, which has come up. I mean, proxy is a stand-in, and this is one of the criteria used to select people, is their interest in proxies. So what did you understand by a proxy, and how did this shape the way that you worked with people? I mean, in some ways, Janice's story about mother's clothing is a proxy for presence of her mother, right? So I'd like to hear more about that.
I wish I could do another project now where I painted almost likenesses, and they would be proxies. I think of the pictures themselves as being proxies. I also think, and I wanted to, and I sort of started to really think about that a lot. And they're proxies in different ways for different, they're proxies for the people, but they're also in some ways proxies for affection, say, all sorts of different things. And I had originally thought about inviting people who were secretaries, because it seems to me, you don't get them so much nowadays, but for my generation, there were secretaries I was trained as one. They were a thing, and you were a sort of proxy for usually the male boss you were working for, in some way. And so I was thinking about it like that. I actually ended up, unfortunately, I've got a feeling I did work with someone who had been a secretary, but I can't remember offhand who now. But so I was thinking about, I worked with a couple of artists who both in different ways. Oh, one of them, well, several artists I know, and maybe women artists particularly, have proxy artist personas. So they have one artist persona who makes a certain type of work, but then they find they're making, in different situation, they're making a different type of work, possibly for a different end. So for instance, they might be trying to make some kind of commercial sales. So they give themselves proxy names. Or for instance, somebody who's in the film, she had made work, she was making work, in some ways you're distinguishing between the work that you think is acceptable to make and other work that is not quite so serious or something, and you make this other work and you give yourself another name to make that work. And I know several women artists who've done that. And then there's another proxy, which is another woman artist who's included in the film, Jemima Brown. She, for a while, she was making work with a doll, and crediting the doll as well as her as having made the work. And it seems to me that portraiture is very similar to dolls anyway. So there's kind of, I'm not clear, I don't think I've got a clear answer, but it's just these kind of rambling ideas about the way in which one can find proxies to give one strength, really, or give one alternatives ways of operating.
Well, thank you, Flick. Unfortunately, it's 8 o'clock. So, well, 8 o'clock here in the UK. So I need to wrap things up, to say thank you, well, to you, Flick, for your amazing contribution to our project and for the work that you've done, but also to the other participants this evening, to Janice Cheddi, to Will Viney, to Scott Walk, and to Barry Schwabsky. Thank you all. I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. I want to say, I think you can see one of the portraits that Flick has painted at the Royal Academy, and that the film is going to be shown at the Margate Film Festival
this weekend. Yeah.
This weekend. And as I said, you will also be able to see it on our website shortly, for a restricted period of 3 weeks to begin with. So I want to thank you all, and actually to thank everybody on the People Like You team, including Yale and Henrika, for helping it go as smoothly as it did. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.